As you can see from my title, I've taken advantage of my constitutional privilege of hyperbole, but I hope that I've identified a critical moment, both for the Regional Plan Association and for the New York City region, that speaks to the deeper issue of what planning is in a democracy. Now, the occasion for this talk is, of course, the 100th anniversary of the Regional Plan Association, as well as the magnificent exhibition that the RPA mounted in Grand Central Terminal in October. And as an historian, I'm professionally attached to anniversaries, especially to anniversaries that have 2 zeros after them, because they give us the opportunity to really think about what is important, what has endured over time. And I want to start, in that spirit with 2 remarkable facts, and then with a question. The first one is, what Peter Hall, the great English planner, identified in 1966, that the RPA, throughout its 100-year history, has been the only body, official or unofficial, taking a serious and continuous look at the planning problems of the New York region as a whole. And I think even more important, more remarkable as a fact, is that during that whole 100-year period, New York City has maintained its position at the top of the global urban hierarchy. There have been pretenders, there have been contenders, ranging from Berlin and Moscow in the 20th century to Shanghai and Beijing in our time. But New York has maintained its position, as Robert Yarrow and Tony Hiss wrote in 1966, as the economic, political, cultural, and communications capital of the world. So my question, that will be, in effect, the basis of this talk, is what role, if any, did regional planning play in maintaining New York's global ascendancy over the last century? And I felt it necessary to include that little phrase, if any, because New Yorkers and New York planners in particular have been contentious people. And you might say the whole history of the interpretation of planning in New York has been of intense criticism with regard to the RPA, going back to Lewis Mumford's stringent criticism of the RPA after the first regional plan of 1929 to 31, and then Thomas Adams, the president of the New York regional plan, criticizing Mumford. Then jumping to the 60s, Jane Jacobs criticizing Mumford, Mumford criticizing Jane Jacobs, Robert Moses criticizing everybody, and everybody criticizing Robert Moses. If one had to conceptualize or visualize this historiography of planning, I think it would look something like this. All right. So it's important, I think, in the, especially in the context of this magnificent exhibition, to respond to this, shall we say, negativity, and to try to understand how the Regional Plan Association, how regional planning in general, has sustained New York City's position at the top of the regional global hierarchy. Now, there are so many approaches to this issue, and in my short talk, I want to zero in on just one of them. And that is the issue of the survival, the literal survival of rail-based mass transit in the New York City region. It's amazing that this became an issue, and yet, as I hope to show, it very much was. Now, this issue came to a head during the period associated with the RPA's second regional plan, which was essentially the 1950s and the 1960s. As you can see, the regional plan was an interrelated series of surveys and plans from the 1950s and 1960s, in which the issue of transportation came necessarily to the fore. And I think it was an issue that drew upon the deepest meaning of the RPA, of the regional planning initiative itself. Because if you trace it back, not just to the first regional plan of the 1920s, but to its great model, the Plan of Chicago of 1909, I think you can see very clearly that what was on the minds of the founders was this issue of planning in a democracy. If you go back to the 19th century, the model for urban planning, urban design, was the rebuilding of Paris by Louis Napoleon, the Emperor of France, Georges Haussmann, the prefect of Paris, which was very much carried out under the auspices of a top-down authoritarian regime. And so the question that American planners raised a century ago and more was it possible? How was it possible to achieve the kind of coordination that a great modern city demands without the authoritarian government, without a prefect of New York or an emperor of the United States? And their answer, first in the regional plan of Chicago, and then in the first regional plan of the RPA, was that if you could bring together a dedicated core of the best urban designers, the best planners, and allow them the freedom to look at the great metropolitan region as a whole, gave them the opportunity to put forward these wonderfully comprehensive, coordinated plans in a magnificent presentation. That would set the agenda for a whole metropolitan region in which private players, governments, and so on would in effect work together to carry out in their own ways the plan. Now, sometimes this worked, as it did in the first regional plan with the plan for the highways that was carried out by Robert Moses, by the Port Authority, and so on. But just as often, it didn't work. We sometimes forget that even more important to this first regional plan than the highways was their plan for a new rail network that would bring remarkable efficiency both for passengers and freight, but that depended on all the railroads in the region cooperating on a very ambitious set of infrastructure investments. And none of this basically happened because the railroad simply refused to cooperate. And there is nothing that the planners could do about it. This was a problem for the New York City region in the 30s and during the Second World War. After the war, it became an even greater problem, as I say, in which the very survival of rail-based mass transit, not just the commuter lines, but the subways, was in danger. And by that time, the 1940s, 1950s, all of the major railroads had entered into their death wish phase, hurtling towards bankruptcy, determined to provide the worst possible service to commuters as a way of abolishing commuter rail entirely. And and commuter rail was in their palsied hands, unfortunately. There was, of course, the governments. The New York City region famously has 1,400 governments. This was one of the better known surveys from the second regional plan. The problem there, of course, was that each of these governments was perhaps most skilled in burden shifting, in evading responsibilities for regional transit. The one government that could not evade its responsibility, New York City, with its responsibility for the subway system, already the city was hurtling towards the bankruptcy or near bankruptcy of the 1970s. So government was paralyzed in effect. And the two public authorities that had a remarkable amount of resources, Robert Moses and the Triborough Bridge Authority, Austin Taubman and the Port Authority, they were bitter rivals in the 1940s and 1950s, but they agreed on one thing, which was that transit was a money pit, that all of their tremendous revenues from tolls and other sources had to be kept away from the transit system. And finally, perhaps worst of all, the federal government had made in the 1956 Highway Act, had in effect decided in favor of highways over transit, that would receive, highways would receive tremendous subsidies, transit virtually nothing. So in all these ways, the rail-based transit in the New York City region was in danger. Its very survival in doubt. And you had the nightmare situation, as we see here in this joint study from the Port Authority and the Triborough Bridge Authority, that the highway and bridge, automobile bridge projects would receive or could receive virtually unlimited funding, no matter how crazy and extreme they are, such as the Lower Manhattan Expressway that you see here, or the Mid-Manhattan Expressway that would have run directly through the Garment District. These wild, impossible plans could have received virtually limited funding, whereas the transit that the region depended on would get nothing at all. That was the nightmare that really opened up in the mid-1950s. As I say, the possible destruction of mass transit. So how does the regional plan respond? I think it's a key moment for the New York region and for the very meaning of regional planning that changes to respond to this challenge. The first thing that the RPA does is to put forward another vision of the New York City region, not so much dependent on these magnificent images that feature in the exhibition, but come out of the work of two Harvard economists, Edgar Hoover and Raymond Vernon. And they asked themselves a very basic question. What is New York City's comparative advantage over other American cities, over other world cities? What makes New York, New York? And they answer with this phrase, producing the unpredictable, that New York excelled in face-to-face communication, speed of decision, flexibility, a highly skilled, diversified labor force, and other skilled services. And for these to really work at their maximum efficiency, what you needed above all was density, was the capacity to bring all of these remarkably skilled, uniquely skilled people together for this intense face-to-face communication. It's interesting, I think, that they very much anticipate both Jane Jacobs in Death and Life of American Cities, Rem Koolhaas and his concept of culture of congestion. In many ways, it was all there already. So there was first this interpretation, this larger interpretation of the New York City region. Then the plan becomes, or the RPA, the organization becomes a kind of think tank for the metropolitan region with a profound analysis of highways versus rail, especially in this critical issue of what forms of transportation can sustain the intense density that is New York City's genius and glory. Interestingly enough, the Port Authority, the Triborough Bridge Authority never bothered to do this kind of analysis that showed beyond any doubt that no matter how many expressways you build, you can never sustain the density at the core of the region. Only rail-based transportation can do this. So they provide this intellectual, economic justification for the critical role of rail. But going beyond that, as I've indicated, in the first regional plan, the emphasis was on these wonderfully coordinated, glorious visions of new infrastructure and so on. When you switch to this issue of survival, for a key regional function, the regional plan moves into the area that the German sociologist Max Weber is called the slow boring of hard boards. And what that meant in practice for the RPA was deep involvement in a whole series of commissions, committees, Senate hearings, and so on, none of which seemed to really achieve all that much, all of which kind of seemed to peter out. But through this, as Weber would put it, slow boring of hard boards, they managed, I think, not alone, but through working with other powerful interests in the New York City region, through being conveners and backup and so on, they managed to establish some very basic consensus about the importance of maintaining transit and how it could be done. Essentially, these two basic concepts: the primary responsibility of state government to mobilize the regional tax base and to create new public transit institutions, as well as the responsibility of the federal government to flex what was the immense funding coming in from the gasoline taxes to support capital investment in transit. And so out of this comes a method. Now, these concepts, these approaches, though, had to be implemented in the context of continual emergencies, bankruptcies, threatened closures, cutbacks in services. What the commuters experienced, sadly enough, and the subway riders experienced was these series of cutbacks and emergencies during which this consensus was finally emerged. And of course, it wasn't the RPA alone that was able to do that. Fortunately, there were politicians who were able to grasp these basic issues and had the power and imagination to implement them, starting with Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York State. Here you see him with William J. Ronan, his principal aide, first head of the Metropolitan Commuter Transportation Authority that becomes the current Metropolitan Transportation Authority. John Lindsay, the mayor of New York City, who again had the insight and imagination to understand that New York City would have to give up its sole control over the subway system that was so crucial to its existence. All of these coming to a head in 1968. When Nelson Rockefeller manages to push Robert Moses out of the Triborough Bridge Authority to take over that massive source of funding and to unify the commuter rail and subway under today's Metropolitan Transportation Authority. This is what we mean, or this, I think, is what Weber meant when he referred to the slow boring of hard boards. And, the results are imperfect. The region has never been coordinated the way its great international rivals are. Nevertheless, I think the critical steps were taken for New York to survive, for the New York region to survive as a region that uniquely in the United States runs on rail and can benefit from rail to support its unique characteristics as the greatest of global cities. So I want to just return to the exhibition, and what I think, in other words, what I would posit are its deepest lessons, which is for in a democracy, for democratic planning to work, you need not only the 1,400 governments, but you need a core of dedicated planners who, as Peter Hall said, have the ability to look at the region as a whole, to think long term, and in this way, in partnership with the citizens, with the governments, to work towards a truly coherent and great city. So that to me, as I say, is the great lesson of the 100 years of the Regional Plan Association, and I think we can thank the planners who did this work for their role in saving the world's greatest metropolis.